Good morning. Now it's past a few minutes past 10 o'clock. We'd like to start the seminar. Good morning. Thank you very much for coming to this seminar hosted by US-Japan Research Institute. My name is Fumiaki Kubo of the University of Tokyo, as well as Uto Wilson Center for International Scholars. I'm one of the board members of the US-Japan Research Institute. First, let me talk a little bit about the US-Japan Research Institute. This institute was established in 2009 as a 501c3 organization here in DC. 8 universities in Japan, Kyushu University, Kyoto, Keio, Tsukuba, University of Tokyo, Doshisha, Ritsumeikan, and Waseda are member universities. And we also receive generous financial support from individuals and private companies. This has, as I said, 501c3 legal qualification, so any donations are welcome anytime. From time to time, we hold seminars and symposium, but twice a year we become particularly active during the week called USJI Week. In fact, today is the second day of the first USJI Week this year. We held our first USJI Week in September of 2009, and today's co-chair, Professor Ito, was one of the panelists at that time, and so this is his second appearance, a very memorable one. This particular seminar is organized by Professor Ito and myself. We teach at the University of Tokyo, and we serve, as I said, as a co-chair for today's seminar. We hope we don't have to fight each other. When we met one day on campus, we agreed that it would be wonderful if we could hold a seminar here explaining and analyzing the economic and foreign policy of Japan under administration of Shinzo Abe. To our delight, Dr. Stefan Danninger and Dr. Michael Austin very kindly agreed to join us today. We thank you for your cooperation very much. One thing, we are video recording this session, and it will be made public later on the internet. Though we might cut some parts of the seminar depending on the necessity. I hope you're kindly understanding. Just back to the seminar. As you might know, Prime Minister Abe's economic policy, often called Abenomics, has achieved some significant outcome, while we are not sure about its long-term effectiveness. In the area of foreign and national security policy, Mr. Abe has made significant progress in some areas as well, while Japan's relations with China and Korea are perhaps in the worst situation in decades. Moreover, there seem to be some frictions even between Japan and the United States too. We would like to address these issues in this seminar. Then I will ask Professor Ito to be moderator for the next 2 presentations.
Okay, my name is Takatoshi Ito. I'm a professor at the University of Tokyo, and I will be chairing the first half of the presentation among 4 of us. And let me introduce 2 presenters. Professor Kubo is a Barton Hepburn Professor of American Government and History at the Graduate School of Law and Politics, University of Tokyo. And he's currently a resident in Washington, D.C. at the Wilson Center. He received a PhD from University of Tokyo in 1989, and he has written and edited many books, which include the United States, East Asia, ideology and foreign policy after Iraq in the United States, and other topics. And Michael Austin is a columnist for the Wall Street Journal, writing about Asia and global security. He's also a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute for Public Policy Research in Washington, D.C., and concurrently a resident scholar in Asian Studies and Director of Japanese Studies. So he specializes in U.S. defense and foreign policy, security and political relations in the Indo-Pacific region, and global air power and maritime issues. So we have these two wonderful presenters, and we proceed with the presentation. So each of you has 15 minutes. So, Professor Kubo.
Thank you very much for a very kind introduction. I'd like to address the foreign policy of Prime Minister Abe, mostly in the context of US-Japan relations. First, I would like to start by touching upon the US-Japan relations under the administrations of the Democratic Party of Japan, DPJ, from 2009 to 12, which were rough and bad. The Obama administration was very critical of the DPJ government, especially critical of Prime Minister Hatoyama. Compared to that performance of the DPJ government, I think we must give Prime Minister Abe much better scores for his foreign policy. He strengthened the National Security Council and made it more functional. He increased the defense budget for 2 fiscal years in a row, which had been cut or just flat for many years. He also successfully enacted Japan's first government secrecy protection law, and he made significant progress in relocating Futenma Air Station in Okinawa, which had long been in political stalemate. And he revised the national defense program outline. He eased and is easing further the ban on weapon export. These are very solid set of achievements accomplished almost within a year. In Japan, actually, just to be a prime minister for more than a year is a great achievement. By the way, for Mr. Abe, this is his second term. His first term is 2006 and 7, and his first term was a miserable failure. His second term is remarkably better than his first one. He probably learned many lessons from his failure, but that doesn't mean that I would like to give second chance to every former prime ministers. Now our prime minister is ambitious enough to pursue even bigger ticket items. These include the revision of the government interpretation on the right to collective self-defense and constitutional amendments, especially its Article 9. The right to collective self-defense is a right to fight for the allies or very close countries when they are attacked. This right is granted to every member country of the United Nations. However, in the case of Japan, the government has made it an established official interpretation that Japan cannot exercise this right under the Article 9 of the current constitution. Now, he tries to change this interpretation, but it would not be easy for him to implement this reinterpretation, mostly because his coalition partner, New Kome Party, or Komeito in Japanese, is still opposed to the reinterpretation. But what is important, or the thing I'd like to emphasize here, is that even if Prime Minister Abe achieves these goals, even if Mr. Abe gets everything that he wanted to get, Japan can still not be considered a so-called normal country. Japan will keep Article 9 that might be slightly revised so that the self-defense forces can be dispatched abroad a bit more easily, but only for peacekeeping operations under United Nations resolutions, not to wage war, unless for the self-defense, including collective self-defense. Even if the Japanese government under Abe successfully revised the interpretation of the right to collective self-defense, Japan's foreign and security policy will not be radically different from what it has been or from what it is. Japan today faces the first threat to its territory since 1945, except the case of Takeshima or doctrine Korea, which was taken unilaterally by Korea. However, even in this situation, the public is still not fully in favor of an even small change of conventional foreign and security policy. Established media of a progressive orientation is against the change, as is observed in the case of the state secret law. For a long time, the United States has criticized Japan's foreign and security policy as being too cautious, inward-looking, as unwilling to take measures to be a stronger and full alliance partner for the United States. And overall, the response by the Japanese government has been cautious, piecemeal, reactive, or outright negative. In this context, the way that the Abe administration has acted on these issues is different from that of many former prime ministers. Here is one of my points. Japan under Mr. Abe is, to some extent, could be a problem, but probably at the same time a rare chance for the United States to embrace in order to strengthen the alliance at this fundamental level. However, these days there are small changes observed in the US government's attitude to its alliance with Japan. The records of the Obama administration's first term was pretty good, but in his second term, by contrast, for example, we are concerned a little bit about Susan Rice, the speech entitled America's Future in Asia, delivered in November last year at Georgetown University. She said in that speech that when it comes to China, we seek to operationalize a new model of major power relations. In this phrase, it appeared that she accepted Chinese terms. The word operationalize sounds as if the US does not have serious problems with China. And in this speech, and also question and answer session, she did not mention that the Senkaku Islands were under Japan's effective administrative control, nor did she refer to the US treaty obligation to defend them under Article 5. This speech made, as I said, many foreign policy observers in Japan concerned because of its tone, the importance of the person that delivered the speech, and the importance of the title. Of course, there are positive messages or actions too, such as the strong endorsement of Japan's reinterpretation of the right to collective self-defense by the Secretary of State Kerry and Secretary of Defense Hagel last year, or two B-52 bombers that went into the air defense identification zone unilaterally declared by China in late 2013. Now I'll touch a little bit about the issue of the Senkaku Islands. We sometimes hear our American friends say, don't test us over rocks. But it is not just Japan, I would say, not just the United States, but both Japan and the United States are being tested over this dispute now. Japan, for its part, must do everything necessary to defend its own territory, although Japan must act with caution so not provoke China unnecessarily. And the United States, for its part, needs to make it more than clear that it will defend Japan's territory. As many of you know, the US-Japan alliance has an asymmetrical structure in terms of rights and obligations that each party enjoys and incurs. Japan's obligation is to let US government use military bases in Japan, while it is not obligated to defend the United States when it is attacked. The obligation of the US government, United States, is to defend Japan, and furthermore, the United States can use the military bases in Japan not just to defend Japan, but also for the peace and the stability of the Far East. So this is how the asymmetrical nature stands. In this context, it is safe to say, and I hope you would agree with me, that Japan has basically and faithfully fulfilled its part of treaty obligations since 1952, an obligation that has been a burden, as well as a benefit, but burden to some local Japanese, especially in Okinawa. If the alliance does not work at the moment when it is most needed by Japan, at the moment of truth, it will just decay or atrophy, inviting disappointment with and distrust in the US on the part of Japan. And the United States should therefore emphasize its commitment in the strongest possible way on every possible occasion. By the way, I noticed recently that some of the Republican senators, like John McCain and Marco Rubio, started to propose that the US government recognize that the Senkaku Islands actually belong to Japan, reversing the conventional policy not to take sides on the sovereignty issue. This new attitude might be shared by more politicians in the near future, to include several presidential candidates for 2016. I'm sure the Japanese embassy is watching that closely. Probably here I should say a little bit about the word nationalistic, which is put to Mr. Abe very often in Japan and also abroad. And in Japan, any effort to challenge the status quo or pacifist-oriented foreign policy is instantly regarded and defined as conservative or nationalistic by the media in Japan, sometimes even using such qualifiers as hyper or ultra. And some of the international media and the foreign commentators, including the New York Times, tend to make full use of these words to suggest that Mr. Abe is a dangerous hyper-nationalist trying to return Japan to the state of the 1930s or even starting the war. But the reality is that at issue is whether Japan keeps Article 9 intact or revise it slightly to enable peacekeeping operations within the UN, not whether Japan keeps it or discards it. At issue here is whether Japan increases the defense budget just slightly, not whether Japan increases it by more than 10% for the coming 2 decades, or whether Japan goes nuclear or not. The crucial point here is that the center of the controversy in Japan on security matters is located at the pole or edge closer to pacifism vis-a-vis the militarism or hyper-nationalism or hawkish or unilateral foreign policy. On the universal or global continuum scale from like pole like minus 100 to plus 100, and this is 0. Probably Japan stands at like minus 70, and now moving to like minus 40, 35, while probably China stands at plus 80, and probably United States stands at like 50 or 60. So I think we should have a kind of sense of the perspective of comparison. Interestingly enough, within the United States, Republicans often call President Obama a dangerous socialist. The United States, however, is probably one of the least socialistic countries in the world next to China. That President Obama is attacked as a socialist in the United States does not mean that he's a dangerous socialist by any global standard. Probably he's not Stalin or Pol Pot. On the scale from statism, socialism to free market libertarianism, the center of American politics, the domestic politics stands at probably closer to a free market libertarianism by the world standard. Unfortunately, for and to the regret of the Republicans, international media does not take their definition of Obama. I skip on the issue of Yasukuni, but I was against that. I just thought that the word, the disappointment was, it is slightly better it had been communicated in private. And I stop in a minute. As a last point, I would mention what Japan thinks of its past. It is sometimes pointed out that Japan has never felt sorry for what it did before 1945. Actually, Japan has apologized many times. If you put the words Japan and apology in Google, there's so many entries, like 54, including by the emperor and by prime ministers. Someone built this entry. But in addition, The way Japan has conducted and run its foreign and national security policy since the end of the World War II should be a good testimony to how Japan has felt about what it did before. A pacifist-oriented foreign policy has been entrenched and ingrained in the Japanese psyche very deeply, perhaps too much, to accept the logic of alliance with the United States from time to time. It's also important to pay attention to how Japan has dealt with its own territorial disputes with Russia and Korea. Japan has never tried to change the status quo in a unilateral way or by force. It has consistently tried to solve the problems through negotiations and diplomacy. What China does with regard to the Senkaku Islands these days is trying to change the current situation by force, by intimidation, or by the threat of use of force, like by entering Japan's territorial waters almost every week. The issue here for us and for you too is whether to choose an international order where all the disputes are expected to be solved by peaceful means, or alternative international order that China dictates, where the use of force is allowed to solve territorial disputes. Japan firmly supports the former. Last word, this is my final point. When President Obama comes to Japan in April, we'd like to hear a really strong speech with substance, based on principles. We'd like him to speak about the kind of international order that he'd like to maintain, probably working with its allies, including Japan, which has to be the international order where unilateral action or threat of force be never allowed. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ito-sensei and Kubo-sensei. It's a pleasure to be with you again and to talk with all of you today. And I think that was an outstanding overview by Kubo-sensei of so many of the issues that face the U.S.-Japan alliance and the Abe administration's approach. So I think it's probably best for me just to try to put some of what we've been talking about into a broader context. Now, the first thing I would say is that there's no question that sitting in February of 2014, we are in a worse situation in East Asia than we were in February of 2013. The last year did not get better. There was not peaceful resolution of problems. There was not movement towards greater understanding or greater ability to have confidence of solving these problems. Rather, by the end of Prime Minister Abe's first year in his second term, I think it's objectively clear that the Northeast Asian security situation is more tenuous and more dangerous than before. I also think that's probably Prime Minister Abe's own conclusion. I think that's his own analysis. If you look at what happened over that past year, things that we would have never really expected or assumed would be even risked, for example, by China, we've all just now absorbed and said, okay, it's business as usual and let's move on. That includes the air defense identification zone over the East China Sea. If you want to look to the south, it also includes expanded claims in the South China Sea. It is as well a year in which we had less movement forward on North Korea than we even usually have. And if you look at where we stand with North Korea today, we know less about what's happening in Pyongyang. We don't know how much influence China has in Pyongyang after the execution of Chang Song-tek. We have no assurance that there is really any road forward to try and peacefully resolve the nuclear crisis on the Korean Peninsula. And so the entire region seems to be not only more tense, but almost as though it's waiting for the next crisis, the next shoe to drop. In some ways, we're lucky nothing worse has happened, but we certainly can't be confident that we're moving in the right direction. Well, one thing to note, which I think is quite interesting, is it probably could have been expected that 2013 would have been a very difficult year, maybe even an unstable year, when you look at the fact that there were 4 new or relatively new leaders in Northeast Asia. So we had Prime Minister Abe come in at the end of 2012. Xi Jinping took over in China. President Park Geun-hye, took over in Korea. And just a year before that, Kim Jong-un took over when his father died in North Korea. So there was actually little expectation, I think, we could have that 2013 would be a smooth year. It's always difficult when new leaders come into power for them to figure out what their policies are going to be, what they want to do differently from their predecessors, what they want to take advantage of, or if they want to try to strike out and make a mark on their own. And I think it's clear that each of these leaders, Prime Minister Abe included, has decided to strike out and make a mark on their own. For America and for Japan, we need to understand the context, particularly of China, in which, unlike his two immediate predecessors, Hu Jintao and Jiang Zemin, President Xi of China has consolidated his power in 1 year. Now, it took both Hu and Jiang years to consolidate their power. And in a 10-year term of office that they have, Jiang Zemin really didn't have power until 3, 4, 5 years in, and Hu Jintao at least for 3 years, and some would say he never really had full authority over the military. Xi Jinping has consolidated his power politically and militarily in 1 year. So he has 9 full years of his term to push forward his policies. He streamlined the Central Committee. He set up his own type of National Security Council. He has reduced the number of competing voices in the inner circles in China. And I think it's very clear, if you look at what he's been doing, there is a firm focus on, number one, domestic reform at home that will actually protect the party. Whether it'll actually help the Chinese people is a different story, but it'll protect the party. And abroad, making absolutely no concessions on territorial issues, and in fact pushing those territorial issues farther than before. If you look at Madam Park in Korea, she has very clearly decided to move away from the tenuous, always tenuous Japan-Korea relationship, move farther away from that, and inch South Korea closer to Beijing. She has welcomed meeting with President Xi, and they're going to have a summit this year. She has talked about a trilateral that includes the United States, China, and South Korea, but not Japan. And she has steadfastly refused to meet Prime Minister Abe even before the Yasukuni visit in last December. So she has also struck out with a new foreign and diplomatic policy to try and separate South Korea off from what Washington has always hoped for, which was a closer U.S., Korea, Japan relationship. That does not seem to be her intention at this point. And obviously there's Kim Jong-un, and I don't think we need to spend too much time talking about him. So one of the interesting wild cards in all of this then is the U.S. Where is the pivot today, the pivot that we talked so much about during the first Obama administration? Well, if you look at John Kerry's visit to Beijing and Seoul, as well as Jakarta just last week, I think we have to say that the pivot has really shrunk dramatically in size. Some, and I've been one, could claim that the pivot is even over. But you have the Obama administration now, after the ADIZ, after a almost complete collapse in Japanese-Korean relations, after the purge in North Korea and the execution of Jiang Zemin. What is the focus, at least publicly, that John Kerry brought to his visit last week? Climate change. Climate change, as he put it, as great a threat to Asia as terrorism. I mean, this to me is a very significant misreading of the trends in the region. You can work on issues like climate change. You have the luxury to work on issues like climate change when you've solved lots of the other problems that you face. It shouldn't be your primary focus in a region that is far more unstable and uncertain and feeling insecure about the future than it did just a year ago. Now, the interesting thing, I think, if you look at U.S.-Japan relations in this period, in some ways concerning, and in other ways we just have to accept this is how state relations work, is that there seems to be a divergence between policy and politics. So if you look at the politics, whether I just mentioned what John Kerry was bringing to the table, or the politics, for example, between Washington and Tokyo right now, which I think we all have to admit are rather strained over the Yasukuni visit and over other issues, and rare public criticism of Japan by the Obama administration, there seems to be a worsening of relations between Tokyo and Washington. But, and Kubo-sensei mentioned some of this briefly, if you look at the policy, not the politics, but if you look at the policy in the region, the policies, we're actually moving in very good directions, and the Obama administration should be given credit for that, as well as Prime Minister Abe. So Professor Kubo mentioned, for example, trying to resolve the Futenma issue in a much more forward and direct way than it has been when it's languished for the past decade. We have the decision that was a DPJ decision, but one that's been carried forward by this administration, the Abe administration, to purchase F-35s to release or relieve the restrictions on arms exports, to talk about carrying out some of the issues that Prime Minister Abe wanted to do his first time in office, such as a National Security Council or reinterpreting Article 9, at least begin those discussions. All of those are things that the United States welcomes. All of those are things that Washington wants to see. It wants to see a Japan that has a larger regional security role, that has a larger budget, although I agree with Professor Kubo, it's going to be limited, but a larger budget. And so if you strip away the politics, if you don't look at what the diplomacy is doing, but you look at what the militaries are doing and what some of the security trends are, we have to say it's actually moving in the right direction. So the question is, in terms of public perception, in terms of the degree of the sense of the working relationship between Tokyo and Washington, which one of these two realities will win out? Will it be the reality of policy moving to enable Japan to play a more forward-leaning and supportive role in the region? Or will it be the politics, which makes it seem that the two parties are actually moving farther away from each other? This is something I think we have to think about very carefully. We have to be very sensitive to. If the politics wins out, if it seems in both capitals that relations are strained, that there's a communications gap, that there's an expectations gap, then that can actually ultimately affect policy and feed into policy. Normally, as an American, I would say a lot of this depends on the Obama administration being in power. It is really up to them to determine what type of overall policy they want to have with our friends and those that we seek better relations with in Asia. But there's no question that Prime Minister Abe is a controversial figure in Asia. I don't think he gets nearly enough credit, as he should, for saying that things like the Maruyama and Kono statements are the basis of Japan's diplomacy in the region today. That any type of reinterpretation of Article 9 is one that does not change Japan's self-defense orientation, but will actually allow it to contribute more to regional security and public goods. I don't think he gets nearly enough credit for saying these things over and over and over. But because the weight, so to speak, on Prime Minister Abe is greater than on other Japanese leaders of recent years, there is a particularly delicate path that he must walk. I would like to see the Obama administration, quite frankly, be more supportive of that path that I think he is trying to thread. And that path, again, is recognizing the problems and difficulties that Japan has with its neighbors, and they are at almost their worst point in post-war history today. But at the same time, look at what he is trying to do to be a more constructive and positive actor. And I don't think we can place all of the blame for bad Sino-Japanese relations and bad Korean-Japanese relations on Prime Minister Abe by any means. I would like to see the Obama administration be more supportive of that. But that's why I'm worried that potentially the politics will win out over the policy. And so if we have to look forward over the next year, this is what I would pay attention to. What are the signals in both capitals? What is the interpretation going on in the media? How are people judging the working relationship between the two? Because if we can focus on what's happening that's positive, then I think we can come out of these turbulent years, even with American drawdowns in its military, with a much closer and stronger working relationship, and not one in which you see two long-term allies increasingly distrustful of each other and criticizing each other in public. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
I hand over the moderator to Fiscal.
Now we enter the economics part. First speaker is Dr. Ito, and Mr. Ito will use the PowerPoint slides, and we should listen to his presentations by seeing Professor Ito is a professor of economics and the dean of Graduate School of Public Policy at the University of Tokyo. He's taught extensively both in the United States and Japan, including at the University of Minnesota, Hitotsubashi University, Columbia Business School, and Harvard University. He also served as a senior advisor in the research department IMF and as deputy vice minister for international affairs at Ministry of Finance, Japan. He's the author of many books, including the Japanese economy. He was president of the Japanese Economic Association in 2004, and he served as a member of the Prime Minister's Council of Economic and Fiscal Policy from 2006 to 8. He was awarded the National Medal with Purple Ribbon in June 2011. The second speaker is Dr. Stefan Dunninger. He is a division chief in the IMF's Asia and Pacific Department. He joined the IMF in the year 2000 and worked in various assignments, including the IMF's World Economic Studies Outlook. His research covers a variety of topics, including determinants of countries' export competitiveness, fiscal reforms, cross-country spillovers of financial stress, and growth-enhancing structural reforms. He holds a PhD from Columbia University. From now, Professor Ito.
Thank you very much, Professor Kubo, and good morning. And my role here is to explain the so-called Abenomics and the achievement in first year and the prospects and challenges for this year. So Abenomics is a package of the economic policy in 3 arrows. And one is the aggressive monetary policy, and second arrow is flexible fiscal stimulus, and third arrow is growth strategy. So this is a package of economic policy. Okay, so aggressive monetary policy has 2 components. One is inflation targeting of 2%, and the quantitative and qualitative easing. So actual action of the monetary policy, but the target was set at the inflation rate being 2%. The second arrow, flexible fiscal policy, has also 2 components. One is short-term stimulus, short-term and sort of timely stimulus, and medium-term consolidation. So first part is stimulus, but the second part is the consolidation, which is a tightening of fiscal policy. The third arrow of growth strategy is actually a collection of many ideas. And those who criticize this third arrow says this is like 1,000 needles. But yes, provided that, granted that this is not one big arrow, but I would say it's like 100 daggers. So there are series of daggers now released, and it's moving towards the target. But granted, I think that it's a very slow process, and they could accelerate the shooting this third arrow. Combined, I would explain these 3 arrows will lift the Japanese economy out of deflation and moving to a more normal growth economy. So we have a concept in economics, the multiple equilibria. So the economy tends to stay in a equilibrium, but there are many equilibria in the economy depending on the expectations and self-fulfilling prophecy type actions and expectations, that it could be a very depressed deflationary spiral or sort of normal growing economy. And this Abenomics can be viewed as lifting the Japanese economy out of 15-year deflation to a more normal state of the advanced economy. But since you are moving out of one equilibrium and put into the new equilibrium, you need a big force, big push. And this Abenomics 3 arrows is all about this moving from one equilibrium to another. So the inflation targeting is very important part of this first arrow. And as soon as the general election was called in November 16th of 2012, that Mr. Abe started to talk about this first arrow. And he criticized Bank of Japan not doing enough to get out of deflation. And he advocated 2% inflation targeting, and he threatened Bank of Japan to adopt. If they do not adopt these policies, then he's ready to change the Bank of Japan law and install appropriate monetary policy. So there was a bit of a conflict between Mr. Abe and the previous regime in Bank of Japan. But he, making long story short, that he prevailed, and inflation targeting was announced in January 2013, even before Mr. Shirakawa resigned. And after Mr. Shirakawa's term was expired, he was not fired. His term was expired, and he was replaced by Mr. Kuroda, who is a long supporter of 2% inflation targeting. So how do you achieve that? Well, to expand the monetary base, which is basically a balance sheet of the central bank. So, which was done actually by FRB, ECB, and BOE right after the Lehman Brothers collapse. So Bank of Japan was complacent after the Lehman Brothers shock, and that contributed to yen appreciation and a stagnation of the Japanese economy from 2009 to 2012. So Governor Koda all changed that on April 4th, and as a result of this, Mr. Abe's talk of the change in monetary policy, an actual change on April 4th, there was a big yen depreciation from about 80 yen per dollar to 100 yen per dollar. And this changed the exporters' profits, and that changed the exporters' stock prices. So Nikkei 225 increased by more than 60% from this mid-November to May 2013, and that significantly increased the prospects of economic growth. And the consumption increased because of the wealth effects, and the mood has dramatically changed from a deflationary shrinking image of the economy to a more normal type of economy, that where the investment and growth will take place. Okay, so first arrow was a big success, no question about it. Now the second arrow, as I mentioned, is a combination of the short-term stimulus, short-term timely counter-cyclical Keynesian stimulus, and medium-term consolidation Why do we need this complicated structure? Well, the Japanese fiscal deficits in the past 20 years has been accumulated into huge mountain of debt. So the government debt to GDP ratio is now 200%, the highest among OECD countries, never seen in history except right after the Second World War. So there is no question that the Japanese government has to tighten fiscal policy in the medium run to avoid a fiscal bust and or the default of the government debt. So we don't have much time to turn around the Titanic, so to speak, to avoid a crisis. And you need to either raise taxes or cut expenditure or have fantastic growth so that tax revenues will increase without raising tax rate. But making long story short, that raising the consumption tax rate, which is a VAT, is only option or only realistic option for Japan to correct this fiscal deficits. So in the medium term, we need to raise consumption tax rate. But in the short run, that there are periods that you need to stimulate the economy, which is like first half of last year and the second quarter of this year. So that's where the short-term stimulus is applied. So let's keep those graphs. And this is my conclusion. Second arrow is a success because Mr. Abe decided to raise the consumption tax rate from 5% to 8% on April 1 this year. And he will decide on the second step of the tax increase from 8% to 10%, effective on October 1st next year. So in two steps, consumption tax rate will raise from 5% to 10%. But that won't be enough. And if Japan wants to keep the European type of welfare states, Japan needs to have the European level of value-added tax, which is around 20%. Okay? So I expect that further fiscal consolidation will take place after next year, but before 2020. But to ease that contractionary effect of the tax hike, we need growth strategy. If we have fantastic economic growth, we may not need to raise tax rate so much to have the tax revenues. So growth strategy that the Abe administration has announced, sort of the collected in the so-called growth strategy booklet, which was published last June. And that has 159 pages and probably have several hundreds of good ideas. The problem is that there was no priority, there was no roadmap, and there was no actions immediately following those announcing the plan. So we need actions, we need implementations of those good ideas. Okay? Now, many people, including even myself, who's a supporter of Prime Minister Abe, thinks that this process of the growth strategy can be accelerated, and we need some big symbolic actions as well as the relevant economic policy changes, deregulation and structural reform in this area. Okay, so the areas identified as important include agriculture, healthcare and medical care, energy, and labor market, including mobilizing women and the after retirement old age people, And agriculture is important because that is relevant in negotiating the FTA and TPP. And TPP is a key, I think, for Japan to move ahead in the trade, opening up the trade. And unfortunately, I guess the negotiation in Singapore just this last weekend did not result in the broad agreements. But we need to conclude TPP by the end of this year, I guess, to make significant progress in opening up the trade. And so that's the agriculture and trade. Those are the interrelated topics. Another topic is the mobilizing the capital market. The Japanese households and also corporations save in the form of bank deposits, too little equity investment. And this was actually reinforced by deflation. During the deflation period and long period of stagnation, it made sense, ex ante and ex post, to hold assets in bank deposits whose return is like 0.01%, but still beating in the real terms of the equity investment. But because of this first arrow and second arrow, that the interest rates will rise. And we need to warn those who hold too much government bonds, like public pension funds and local banks and others, that the time has changed and we are moving toward a more normal economy where equity investment makes sense. Right? So those changes are taking place, and the third arrow, collection of many good ideas, are moving toward the right direction, but just too slow for us. So I don't have time to go into details of those growth policies, but this is the key. This is the key in the second year of the Abe administration. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ito. Now it's time to the turning girl. Sorry to have kept you waiting, the last speaker.
Thank you very much. Great. Thank you very much. Thank you, President Uchida, Professor Kubo and Ito for inviting me to this distinguished panel. The title of my presentation is Abenomics, Good for Japan, Good for the Rest of the World. I think we've heard a lot about the first part of it, Good for Japan. So I'll make one comment on the first part and then mostly focus on the second part, on the spillover component. Like Professor Ito, we see Abenomics in its first year as a quite strong and successful program that has lifted Japan out of lingering slow growth and mild deflationary equilibrium. But it's too early to make a final assessment, and our initial stock taking tells us so far so good. And what we do best at the IMF is point out risks. So even though overall we see Abenomics as being a very strong program, I want to flag in my first part of the presentation some of the domestic risks that need to be tackled for Japan going forward. So let me jump to this slide. This is our growth forecast for Japan, and I want you to look at the right-hand slide, which is the blue line is GDP in level, not in growth rate, and the red bars are the average levels and the numbers on top, the growth rates. This is our current forecast, 1.7, 1.7, 1.7 last year, 2013, 1.7 this year. Looks good, no change, growth stays the same, but if you look more carefully, this is a steep acceleration here, and here we have an almost flat profile. We'll see there's a pickup. This is mostly driven by consumption before the consumption tax increase, and then this is when the consumption tax increase happens. So even though the headline number looks good, there are some challenges ahead. And let me focus on one specific risk that I would like to flag and that has been in the news recently. Near-term risks. One of the big discussions right now ongoing is about wage increases. As you know, wages have been flat or declining in real terms for a period of time. And wages are key to manage the demand implication of the consumption tax increase. If you remember, in April, the rate is set to increase from 5 to 8%. It also is key for moving that momentum that started with wealth effects, as Professor Ito pointed out, forward and keeping that sentiment that has been driving growth positive. Now, what is the outlook for wage increases? This is a bar chart reported by a Reuters survey of 266 firms in September, now one in February this year, on what they plan to do in terms of wages. And as you can see, there is a rather small but growing part of firms that are willing to raise wage increases, but the largest part of the firms still think that they would like to increase bonuses only. This is some positive sign, but it may not. It is a risk that the demand effects of the consumption tax rate increase might be larger than one could expect. For the record, we assume an average increase of 1% in our projections, together with fairly strong employment growth. So we're not that pessimistic. Let me go to the next slide to show you why we think this is important. Here again, this is the data on wage growth. So this is the base wage growth that has been flat so far, despite the quite strong tightening of the labor market. So what might be behind this flat increase or the flat earnings? And there are many, of course, many different reasons. Firms are pessimistic and a deflationary mindset. But one important aspect that should not be overlooked is that Japan has had a very strong increase in what we call non-regular workers, workers that are not covered under the regular employment scheme. And here you can see the share, and the share has grown to 35%. So these are workers that earn lower income, and as the share of these workers rises, average earnings are suppressed. So even though if you get an increase in wages on a given job, if the composition changes, earnings may be not growing as fast. This is a structural problem that may need to be addressed. But let me first tell you how important the lack of a wage increase could be for the near-term outlook. We've done some model analysis using our general equilibrium models at hand and estimated what would happen if nominal wages stayed constant, implying a sustained decrease in real incomes because prices go up as the inflation rate goes up with the consumption tax rate. So what would be the impact? Well, in a first analysis, just assuming that households just spend money without confidence in equity markets being affected, so people are shrugging it off, you have quite minor effects. But if if markets start to respond, equity markets start to respond, household sentiment declines, you can have quite sizable declines in growth. This is 2.5%. So you could fall back as much as to 0. Again, this is an illustrative risk scenario, but it just highlights the stakes of reforms going forward. So based on that scenario analysis and based on this being a risk, we think what's quite important is to address roadblocks to growth. And as Professor Ito, we think reforms to women employment, relaxation of immigration, and addressing this dual structure of the labor market are some of the key elements, not only for the long term, but also for the short term. So this was the first point I wanted to make. Now let me switch to the second part of my presentation, Abenomics, good for the rest of the world. And the punchline is so far yes, and, but it depends on how Abenomics is going to unfold. And these are, bear with me, I'll go quickly through these channels, but these are the important channels that we need to think about how Abenomics as a bigger program of all three arrows being deployed would affect the world. So first of all, higher growth in Japan translates into higher input demand. So yes, if all three arrows are launched, meaning structural reforms are in place, you should definitely expect that this is good for the world. But not if the package is incomplete and you don't see the growth pickup. You might then see a fallback of growth to previous levels, and you don't have that boost that you, for example, seen this year where inputs have been rising quite strongly. Exchange rate, this is the change in the relative price of the competitiveness. If Abenomics is successful, we've seen a depreciation, but if prices go up, this would lead to a real appreciation, and hence over time, this actually would be consistent with a positive effect for the global economy, as it would be combined with higher input demand. But if the package is not incomplete, meaning if second and third arrows are not fired, you might see monetary policy, the Bank of Japan being under pressure, and you might expect further depreciation. So the fallout could be different. Finally, what does it mean sort of like on a longer term horizon? Well, if Japan brings its fiscal house in order, that means the risk of interest rates rising will be smaller. There will be likely lower financial conditions, and that's very helpful for emerging economies, for the world as a whole, and that has not a minor implication of long-term growth. So these are the three channels we're thinking about. Let me give you quickly the numbers behind what the positive outcome would imply for other countries and what an incomplete package would imply. So here you have, let me go back. Here you have, these are illustrative, these are not empirical, these are model simulation. This is how output, real GDP, would differ relative to a world where Abenomics were not taking place. So in a successful scenario, you would see, lo and behold, over the next decade, levels increasing beyond where they were before. So there's positive spillovers. You wonder why Korea would be declining. Well, there would be some trade effects, which I'll get to talk about shortly. But what would happen if reforms don't get completed? You would have a potential outcome of both China and Korea in this model being substantially affected for the medium term, and moving back to baseline outcomes or no improvement for the world, at least for the US, very minor. This is close to zero. So these are sort of like the two worlds we can think about. All right, so let me quickly summarize what happened so far. Well, much of the attention has been on the yen, which Ito pointed it out, has depreciated quite substantially, as we can see here. Well, Abenomics we see is one reason, but it's not the only one. There's been starting of a tapering in the U.S., so a widening interest rate differential, reversal of safe haven flows. So what would we expect that happen? Well, we would have expected that exports by Japan should have grown quite dramatically. And the red line is our model predictions for exports, and the blue line is what happened so far. So far we haven't seen that a spillover through trade and through export channel. What could be the reason? Well, it might be that these effects, which we call J-curve effects, have been delayed. It might just take longer than in the past for exports to pick up, and it's not that easy to substitute away from imports, especially if energy is a large component. But it could also be a sign of more of a structural weakness in Japan, which bode well for Abenomics, would not bode well for Abenomics succeeding at least in the short term. Here are some of the reasons why exports may have not picked up. Japan's firms have started to shift of production abroad. You've seen this increase here, but not particularly accelerated since 2009. But sales of subsidiaries have increased. So at least in the activity in the subsidiaries has been increasing. So that may be one reason why the exports haven't responded. Another one is, if you look at this export market share to China has declined dramatically. This is a bit stronger than in other countries, and this may be sort of what we think of a temporary effect related to the political tensions since in the last few months, in the last quarters, this share has gone up. Let me just skip this time constraint. So where this leaves us is that there is a potential for exports to pick up much slower, which was a concern first by the outside world. But there's a second channel that is worth considering, and that is Japanese outflows on capital outflows. Bank of Japan's easing policies has made it more attractive for investors. These are banks, these are households, these are corporates to put funds abroad, particularly in an environment of rising overseas interest rates. And here you can see what the size of outflows, FDI, bank lending, bond purchases was between July and November of this year. And this is in comparison, the loss in reserves in emerging markets during the tapering shock in May, June, not the last recent episode, but the one last year. You can see that these outflows are quite large in relation to these reserve losses, meaning that there might be actually some offsetting effect from Japan. That is true, and that is a positive potential implication in terms of spillovers, but it is important to note that Japan's outflows mainly go to advanced economies, mostly the US, European markets. These are life insurance companies, pension funds. They look for stable, highly rated funds. The shares down here, this is in portfolio flows. This is what has gone to the ASEAN down here. So it's a small part, but even if only a small part of outflows, these are stocks, I believe, of changes goes to the ASEAN countries, it can make a big impact. So one should not equate gross outflows from Japan as necessarily going to the emerging economies, but given the large size, if just a small share goes there, it can have an effect and alleviate the tightening financing conditions. So let me then, I think, conclude and just sum up and make 3 points. The first one is that Abenomics is going well. We think it's on track. There are risks this year, and they're particularly elevated, simply because we're in the process of leveling off of growth as growth becomes less stimulus-driven. Structural reforms, even though the effects may be out in the medium term, can play an important role as sending a signal, as making investment, making wage increases more palatable. We think that, and I just wanted to underscore it, that there needs to be more fiscal reform. We subscribe to the same view that the second stage needs to go forward, as well as a medium-term plan needs to be adopted. If these reforms in place, there's quite a high scenario, a high chance that spillovers to the rest of the world, to especially Asia, are positive. Trade effects have so far been surprisingly positive. They may be less positive in the near term if exports actually pick up after the depreciation. But we also should not forget that capital outflows, which are part of Abenomics, can have a positive effect for emerging economies, which are sort of in a transition from, as the US Fed tapering is kicking in and financing conditions might become tighter. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Dainger, for your very solid presentation. So we are done with all 4 presentations, and the next session will be chaired by Professor Ito again.
Okay, so the rest of this morning, we do first the panel discussion among 4 of us here, and then we open up to questions from floor. So prepare for your questions, and in the meantime, we'll do some Q&A among ourselves. So we don't have any script, so if you have any questions to other panelists, go ahead. Sure.
Actually, this is not a question, but kind of there's some kind of common inclination with Mr. Abe in economics policy and security policy, which is his readiness to take on conventional policy or take on the political establishment. I think to take on Bank of Japan or the Ministry of Treasurer, was his big, bet, and he announced before the upper house election last year that he would enter the TPP negotiation, which is pretty risky politically. And actually, many political commentators, professional commentators in Japan, predicted that he would do that only after the upper house election. But he did that before the election, and he won big. So I think he should be getting some credit for that, and he is ready to take on other conventional policies, including the security policies that I mentioned in the presentation. And also he will give up the traditional conventional policy of reducing rice paddies in Japan, which were not working at all. But I think many prime ministers did not take that risk to get rid of that policy. So in this sense, I think I say this just to bridge this two areas, economic policy and security policy. I think we can detect some common inclination.
Thank you. Michael?
The only comment that I have is if you look from the political perspective, because I'm not an economist, I think that there's so much skepticism about the third arrow now. And it was no secret what Prime Minister Abe wanted to do economically. And he learned his lesson from his first administration, where he didn't focus at all on the economy and was deeply criticized by it, and a lot of people thought that helped lead to his stepping down after losing the upper house. But so it was no surprise what he wanted to do. He telegraphed it, meaning they told everyone what they were planning. They came up with the idea of the three arrows before the election. And even if you wanted, from a policy perspective, to stagger the implementation, meaning you'd shoot one arrow first, then the second, then the third, you would have expected a very fully fleshed out third arrow. And again, maybe from an economist's perspective, there's more there, but from a political perspective, it seems like a huge failure, quite frankly, that they knew this would be the one thing that would really maintain any type of growth that they were getting out of the monetary stimulus and the fiscal reform. And they also had to know, I mean, again, not as an economist, but that those are time-limited results, right? I mean, the markets will begin reacting back to what, particularly in terms of the monetary easing that you've seen, the yen coming back down. So my question is there really a third arrow? I mean, why did they not have a third arrow? Why did they not make it absolutely clear exactly what they were going to do realistically? Not raise expectations and then have to walk back, well, we're not going to do the labor market this year and we're not going to do the corporate tax this year, so that the sense of doubt grew. Because from a political perspective, it seems like a really grave risk that they've run.
Well, let me answer that question. There is a third arrow. It's moving towards the right direction, but it's just so slow that people don't see it as moving. Having said that, I agree that the situation could have been better, and bigger steps could have been taken. So although I defend the third arrow being there, that I agree that it is slower than it should have been, and but I, as Professor Kubo mentioned, that there are concrete steps which have been taken. I think the administration could have played up a little bit more, or do better communication, and maybe swamped by the political side. And I'm hoping that this will accelerate, and so I give a little bit more time than you. That I think this year, 2014, is crucial. And if we're meeting a year from now and doing the same conversation, yes, I would side with a failure. But I'm willing to give more time to see that further out a little bit. Stefan?
Maybe just to add that it may be underappreciated, some of the first measures that have been taken, especially in agriculture, the commitment to join TPP negotiations and the energy sector reforms. Some of those are intentions, some of those are framework legislation, such as the plan to establish these special economic zones. It may not have any visible outcome at this point, but I think this it showed that the government can agree on a few items and find support in the legislature. Also, as Professor Ito, I think we'll have to wait till the June session, which is, I think, crucial going forward. That said, I think it's quite a challenge, the goal to raise potential growth, which we estimate right now is currently about 0.5% and likely to go up to 1% under what we have assumed a very modest program in our forecast. But going to growth that's higher than that, and I mean in real terms, is challenging. We looked into episodes of countries that managed to increase growth from 1 percentage point over a decade, and we looked ourselves at the sample of advanced economies. So because there the challenge is much larger, and you find only a handful that managed. There was a Netherlands scenario, there was a New Zealand, Finland, Sweden are after the crisis are examples. But what we've also learned is that these countries didn't have the headwind of a shrinking labor force. So it requires sort of like double effort. And I think the fact that there is a shrinking labor force just points to the direction that labor market reform needs to be at the center of the third era. And that's a very difficult one, but we haven't seen as much moving yet.
So just to those of you who do not know the growth theory, you can decompose economic growth into two parts. One is the demographic part, which is how many people are working, the working age population, and the per working age population productivity growth. So even if each Japanese who's working makes the productivity increase by 2%, which was a sort of norm in Koizumi years and even before. But currently, the working age population is shrinking, so that population contribution is negative of 1% to 1.5% in the next 2 to 3 decades. So even if Japanese worker works so hard and make innovation and increase productivity, which is the basis for the increasing wages, that overall economic growth will stay around 0.5 to 1%, which is just Stefan mentioned. And this is a big challenge, and this gives a strains on economic growth, but also pension system and others. So I totally agree that labor reform, including mobilizing women, mobilizing, lengthening the mandatory retirement age, making it higher, and foreign workers. Those are the keys for increasing the growth rate in Japan. Okay.
Yeah, the question to Dr. Austin, not a hostile question, but you said that Xi Jinping is centralizing his power very fast. Which China is more dangerous to Japan? The China where power is concentrated in one person, or where power is dispersed and many actors competing, fighting each other? In which case, each of them like to take a very tougher stance with Japan. So, or it's dangerous anyway. What is your thought? And the second one is probably this relates to the economic policy. What is the current status of the Trade Promotion Authority? Is it likely to be granted to President Obama, the fast track? We are now negotiating hard, like we did in Singapore, but without that authority granted to the president, I think the U.S. stance would be very kind of undermined, weak, and what is the prospect?
Sure, I'll deal with the second one first. I don't think there's a chance of the president getting TPA unless he starts to fight for it. I mean, he hasn't fought for it. Last November, I think it was, over 100 Democratic representatives in Congress sent a letter clearly stating that they were opposed to TPA. The administration didn't do anything about it. Either they are incompetent because they just thought they would naturally get it, or they don't really care about it, or they just didn't pay attention. I don't think we really know, but members of his own party, the few members of his own party that are in favor of TPA and therefore, greatly expanded free trade agreements, we're saying that this is something the president didn't fight for. He didn't put his political capital into it. So right now, Congress is certainly not going to change its mind. And that means, of course, that TPP will probably be dead on arrival here, because even if we get an agreement from the negotiating partners, because each congressperson can just start adding amendments and picking out this and that and changing it. So no, so politically, I don't think it's going to happen. As for your question on China, is a sort of a consolidated China or a decentralized China more of a threat to Japan, or are they equally a threat to Japan? The truth is, I don't think we know enough about how decisions are made in China to really be able to answer that. I don't know if we can ever really say that anything is really fully decentralized. And that's a big argument we have here in Washington, for example, when you look at Chinese actions in the East or South China Seas, and when you see, for example, incidents that people wonder, well, was this approved at the level of Beijing, or was it down at a lower level, or was it in individuals' actions? The truth is we just don't know, and that's after, how much energy and attention do we pay to China, and we really still don't know how it works. Clearly, if you have a consolidated and centralized China that decides, meaning there's a leader who has consolidated and centralized his power, as Xi seems to be doing, who has decided to be cooperative, who has decided to be constructive, and even better for us, has decided that he, for example, wants good relations with Japan, then that can be an enormous benefit. And I think it's time to ask the question. I think I'm actually going to write a column about this. Can Xi Jinping pull a Nixon in China? And you know the Hyogen, the phrase Nixon in China in America means a sort of dramatic, very public action by a leader that is opposite to what you would expect. So Richard Nixon was very anti-communist. That's how he created his entire political career. And then suddenly he went to China and opened up relations with China, which no one thought that he would do it. But then they said, well, you know what? Only Richard Nixon could do it, because he's the only one who could have the credentials of saying, I'm not giving in to the Chinese, but it's a good idea. So we call that Nixon in China. So to me, the question is, can Xi Jinping pull a Nixon in China? Can he go to Japan and say, I want better relations with Japan? I recognize that Japan is a largely pacifist nation that has provided lots of public goods, that has provided billions and hundreds of billions of dollars in overseas development assistance, that's involved in international and multilateral organizations. That Japan is not a threat to China. That Japan is not a threat to peace in Asia. And it is in China's interests to have better relations with Japan. President Nixon changed the course of world history by going to China. For better or for worse, that's something we still don't know, as probably, who was it, that was with Mao, who was Mao's, Zhou Enlai, thank you, yes. Zhou Enlai would have said, it's too early to tell. It's only 30 years, right? You remember his statement about the French Revolution, 200 years, it's too early to tell. It was too early to tell whether what Nixon did was good or bad, but he changed world history. Can Xi Jinping do the same? He has 9 years. He has 9 years. Right now, the data points to worsening Japan-US relations and increasing threat of conflict in Asia. If Xi Jinping continues down this road, I predict there will be outright conflict, not war, but outright conflict between Japan and China before he leaves office. I mean, otherwise we're lucky. That's it. It'll be luck, and luck can happen. But that's not how you want to base your security policies. So right now it's up to Xi Jinping. A decentralized China, I don't think that's what we're looking at right now. But ask yourselves the question, or watch carefully, can Xi Jinping, does he have enough confidence and enough vision to say, I'm going to pull a Nixon in China, but I'm going to do it in Tokyo? That would change Asia, that would change the world.
Thank you. I think we should move on to the second part, Q&A from questions from the floor.
Any question? Probably we want you to identify yourself and probably take a few questions together. Any question? Okay, please. There will be a microphone or no? Oh, yeah, please. Thank you.
Charlie Bear with the Stimson Center. I'm wondering what you think of the thesis that the Abe administration may be waiting on the TPP negotiations to provide a kind of political cover for some of the third era structural reforms, things like the agriculture industry in particular.
Okay. Does anyone have a related question, like TPP or third arrow or growth strategy? I'd like to take that question. Maybe who should
Yeah,
respond?
so the TPP is framed in Japan as both political political achievement and economic achievement, right? So TPP as a framework of these nations with similar economic structure and political system is something that Mr. Abe really wants to be associated with. But also it has a significance that Japan can jump to the FTAs with those member countries. Frankly, Japan is behind those FTA networking and behind Korea and behind China and behind many other advanced countries. So TPP is a chance for Japan to jump the queue and get into the global FTA network. So it is, TPP is important in its own right, but also it's good to persuade the domestic vested interests, so which you mentioned as a political cover. We used to say gaiatsu, which is a foreign commitment, will be a leverage for the domestic reform. So anyway that there is such elements that TPP may override some of the domestic objections.
Thank you. So please, the details.
Thank you for the lectures. My name is Misato Naoko and I'm coming from the University of Tokyo Public Policy. And my question is mainly goes to Professor Kubo and Mr. Oslin. And you have mentioned that East Asian politics is all about like Japanese apologies and many kinds of factors. And I agree with you that Japan has been making many apologies, including Murayama and Kono's statements. But I believe that the emphasis should not be whether Japan has been making apology or not, but I feel like it's more like whether Japanese government has comprehensibility or not. Comprehensibility, the continuity of the apologies. Because I believe even though the Japanese government has been making apologies, many politicians and high-level officials are denying the facts and denying many kinds of apologies from time to time. And that makes the situation worse in East Asia. So what do you think, how do you think that Japan can maintain the comprehensibility or continuity of the apology of East Asia? And my question to Mr. Olson is how the United States can encourage Japan to maintain the comprehensibility and some kind of status in Japan among the other East Asian nations. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Taking the privilege of being a moderator, I asked also to go first.
I don't think the U.S. can actually, I don't think that's our role, and I think the U.S. Has made clear what it would like to see, but I think it really can't go beyond that, and I think that it's a very sensitive issue in terms of how countries react to their own history, and as has been mentioned, there are numerous instances in which the Japanese government officially has apologized for the war. In a free society, individuals get to say things that they want. And if you want to have no free speech in Japan, then you can have consistency in what people say about the war. But I certainly don't think it's the role of the United States to tell a sovereign nation what to do, even if it's certainly publicly, but even if it's something that we're pretty clear about what we'd like to see. There's lots of ways you can get messages across, but I think you have to be very, very, very careful.
My emphasis was, please look at how Japan has lived since the end of the World War II. Look at how the Japanese foreign and national security policy have been since the end of the World War II. Did we, invade any other countries? Probably no. So, this is one point. And also, I said that, Japan actually apologized many times, and probably your question is, is that enough, or we should be more comprehensive? But I think, we should make a difference between a very official remarks, statement issued by the Prime Minister, approved by the Cabinet, or other just kind of private conversations, remarks. And I think some commentators who are not knowledgeable enough tend to say that Murayama statement is just his personal statement, which is wrong. It was a cabinet statement, and the cabinet is the highest organ in the Japanese executive branch. Prime Minister cannot make any decisions, formally. And in a constitutional system, cabinet is the most important decision-making organization in the executive branch. And the Murayama statement was approved by the cabinet. And the successive cabinets, I think basically all have taken over the Murayama statement. So I think, it's regrettable that many people say many things, but as Dr. Olson said, we have free speech. Any person can say anything. That is the same here with the United States or Korea. So I think you maybe should make that distinction, which is very important. Any other questions? Please. Yes.
Thank you for the wonderful speech. My name is Pingru from University of Tokyo. I'm from Singapore. Then I'm doing a Masters of Public Policy in Tokyo. So my question is to Mr. Austin, because in terms of Japan and Korea being strong allies with the United States, how can US actually play a role in moderating their relationship? How can they bring Japan and Korea closer in a sense? Because you do see that both of them are distancing themselves. And then with regards to just now, Misato's statement about Murayama's statement, I feel that it's more about sincerity in the apologies. With the 70th anniversary of the end of war, can Japan actually do anything to sort of like reinforce their statement, Murayama's statement and Kono's statement in a sense? Yep.
I mean, you raise an important point, and I think that is, it's very difficult from the U.S. perspective for the U.S. to be as effective as it wants to be in Asia if its two main allies hardly talk to each other and won't cooperate. We have trilateral meetings and trilateral negotiations, but we have very little overall and meaningful trilateral cooperation between Japan and Korea and the U.S. So I'll start off the answer by basically saying what I said last time, which is, if Japan and Korea, if Tokyo and Seoul want to have better relations, it's up to them. It's not up to the United States, and we can't force two countries to have better relations. It really depends on Tokyo and Seoul, and right now there's no indication that Seoul is interested in better relations, and a lot of my friends in Japan are telling me that the Japanese are getting quite fed up with that. There's Seoul fatigue in Tokyo, I'm being told over and over. And I hope our Korean friends are aware of this. I hope our Korean friends are aware of the result or the effect of the sort of constant statements and actions that they're taking. And if they are aware and they're comfortable with it, then that's fine. But there's always a price to be paid. That said, however, I think it has been a grave failure on the part of the United States not to do much more quietly and privately, and quite frankly, bluntly, between two friends to try to get relations better. Not because we can say, look, you guys should be friends, that's not up to us, but what are your interests? Your interests are the same. Your interests are the same as our interests. You face the same threats. Your societies look almost identical to each other with all of their unique differences. They are much closer to each other than any other two nations in Asia. Japan and Korea should be the core of a liberal Asia. Northeast, East, Southeast, whatever you want to call it. Japan and Korea should be the core and should have been the core for a liberal Asia over the past decade or 15 years. it's been a wasted decade. It could have fundamentally changed people's conceptions about the future of Asia if you had a type of relationship between Japan and Korea that you have, for example, between Germany and France, which transformed the European continent. Seoul and Tokyo could have transformed Asia and chose not to do so. The US should have been much blunter in talking to both about how they are working against their own interests. That the world around them really doesn't care whether they're not talking to each other, because it's to other countries' advantage. It's to North Korea's advantage, quite honestly, it's to China's advantage. But it's not to Japan and South Korea's advantage, and it's not to the advantage of the United States. So, yeah, I think they should have done more, but at the end of the day, it's up to the peoples and the governments of Japan and South Korea to say, you know what? We should be looking forward into the future, and we have much more to gain from working together, which is natural for us, than it is to be focused solely and only on the past.
Just a few things. Some of the complaints that Koreans have about Japan are understandable, but others are not, which includes their opposition to the Japan's effort to change the interpretation about the collective self-defense. Because the most likely scenario is that there happens something on the Korean Peninsula, and U.S. troops will help Korean troops, South Korea. And then, the most U.S. troops will, be sent from Japanese military bases. And should we do nothing? No, we have to help twist first American because we are allies. Then that will probably mean helping Koreans, South Koreans too greatly. But if we do nothing, or if our operation is limited, I think it will be the Koreans, South Koreans themselves that will suffer greatly. But in spite of this kind of logical, likely scenario, I think many of the Koreans are against our effort, which is not, understandable. And a small thing, President Obama will visit Japan as well as Korea this coming April, and I think Koreans strongly request that Obama visit Korea, not just Japan. I think since Mr. Obama is giving Korea ROK the great amount of favor by saying yes, I would drop into your country too. I think he now has some leverage, so I'm hopeful that he could, in this particular case, he could use his leverage in a very effective way. Please.
Thank you for your time. My name is Satoko Shingori from TBS Ahi. My question is, what do you foresee for...
With whom are you addressing?
Anybody is fine. Yeah. What do you foresee or expect from the next President Obama's visit to Tokyo? Can TPP is one of the dominant topic? Because last time Prime Minister Abe was here last year, TPP was a huge topic, and then it's actually appealed to the world that Japan-US alliance, in economic-wise, it's very strong. And it seems, the focus is now on the Japan-South Korea issue, but can TPP be the dominant topic for the next summit? Thank you.
As we discussed, not having TPA, it will be very difficult for the Japanese side to play the card, which is liberalize agriculture goods. So I'm not quite sure that possible TPA agreement between Obama and Abe in April. It depends on the assurance that Washington gives to Japan and the assurance Japan gives to Washington. The primary concern on the Japanese side is U.S. not having TPA, that U.S. side can keep the commitment. And primary concern that Washington has to Japan is that, can Japan deliver enough liberalization in agricultural goods. And my speculation at this point is April may be too early to get over those concerns on both sides.
Could you follow up?
Yeah, very difficult for me to comment on the summit, but more generally, I think economic ties between the US and Japan have been quite critical for the last 10 years to support growth in Japan. They have, over the global crisis, we know that economic ties have, though being strong, have weakened simply because adjustment in Japan is a very different one, with an aging society, with deflation, than in the US. So I think what I'm thinking of going forward is for these two countries to strengthen its ties. You have to both think about coordination on the trade side, which TPP being one side, but probably also increased exchanges on all kinds of non-trade, like tariff-related items, which are sort of like the not so well-known part of TPP on standardization, of opening up to FDI. So to the extent that there can be made progress on that front, that would sort of help growth going forward.
Without President Obama receiving the Trade Promotion Authority, I think there will be no big speech, on TPP, because as Professor Ito said, without that, probably Japan thinks that it's not time for us to, play cards, compromise a lot, because even if Japan compromise a lot, that will not be endorsed, supported by U.S. Congress. So that will be just futile. So hopefully there will be a strong speech about the principles of international order, as I said, that Japan and the United States endorses. President Obama has made a very good speech on foreign policy, like in Prague or Cairo, or at the ceremony for the Nobel the Peace Prize, the ceremony, or in Australia, about Asia's the future. But I sometimes feel that these are beautiful speeches, but I think these are not followed up by substance or by policy. He once said at the Nobel Prize ceremony that there's a war that we have to fight, which meant the war against the terror and war in Afghanistan. But now he's withdrawing from Afghanistan. What's the principle? So I won't hear a speech, based on the principles, and that should be kind of followed up by concrete policies. Any question? Samantha, so, please.
Thank you for the speech. My name is Misato Nakayama. I'm a student at Washington College. And my question might be for Kubo-sensei and Ito-sensei. So for demographic change, what do you think the biggest challenge to increase female labor force, and how do you evaluate Abe government policy so far?
The policies to increase the female participation in labor force for the age bracket between 30 to 45, those are the childbearing and caring years, have been well identified. That the increase the daycare for infants, the nurseries, and also extended hours for the kindergarten and elementary school. So those measures need both the budget, the money, and some deregulation, because those setting up those nursery has tight regulations. So that having identified, I think it's a political will which is needed to really carry through those policies. And Mr. Abe has promised, committed that those measures will be taken in next year or two to make those so-called waiting infants will become zero. And beyond that, foreign workers in the medical and healthcare sector will be needed to enhance the long-term care system so that the women will be freed from the caring the aging parents. And those are also being identified and having implemented, but there are substantial problems of those foreign workers to learn Japanese and pass the Japanese exam. But that can be done slightly better, and that I'm sure those measures will be taken. So that there are possible hopeful signs that help is on the way.
Just a small plug-in from our side. We did do some research in this area. It's a paper out that's been featured by also our managing director. It's called "Can Women Save Japan?" and it basically asks the question: to what extent can the increase in labor force participation help offset this headwind from a declining labor force? The items that you mentioned, childcare services, are important, but I think it's also important to make sure that promotion prospects are the same or fair. I think transparency clearly is an issue. Japan stands out in many respects in that area. The government has actually pushed quite aggressively on this front, so we hope there's more to come in this area. One can look at the tax code and other items which may disincentivize employment. That said, how much can you gain from bringing women into the labor force if you look at, think about what the economic impact could be over the transition period, that from now to a period 10, 15 years down the road when more women are in the labor force comparable to other OECD countries, you can estimate around 0.25% of growth higher per year. So that's roughly the estimate that we have. So it helps, but it's not a solution by itself.
Well, is the answer yes? Can women save Japan?
It helps.
Okay, I have nothing to add except to say that I'm in the Department of the Law and the Political Science, and Professor Ito is in the Economics Department. I think we are sometimes criticized for having fewer or small number of female faculty members. Zero. That's 3.
Maybe one. Come April, we will have one.
Okay, any other questions? Probably the last question, please.
Thank you. My name is Igan Zhang. I'm currently a visiting scholar at American University. My question is more toward to Dr. Danningers. And that for me, like economics and politics are intertwined, but from this panel discussion, like economics are economics and politics are politics. So for my question is mainly just the TPP people mentioned about a lot right in these moments. And what I want to ask, like, what would be the worst scenario given current tensions to the TPP negotiation and to the third arrow, to the growth strategy? Would it possibly that if a fail third arrow, a fail in the growth strategy, would it affect Prime Minister Abe's decision in politics, or in what extent, or in other frames? Is it possible that China, to talk about China, Xi Jinping to be Nixon in Asia? Is it possible that, would it possibly that China may buy Prime Minister Abe in economic terms to buy his his I don't know, just efforts in economic tensions between China and Japan? Thank you.
It's a big question. Who goes first?
This is more politics question than economics. On the economics, I think it's very clear that TPP is a critical element. It's not the only element of the growth strategy. And as far I would consider it's still possible that Abenomics can move forward without TPP having been signed. It would be an outcome that's probably one would have could live with, not an ideal situation. What the policy implications or political implications are, I'll pass on to Michael.
I don't have much, much to add. When I was talking about Xi Jinping pulling a Nixon in China, I was really thinking more on the pure security and political relations, not in terms of, if I understood how you were phrasing it, sort of using the economic leverage. I mean, the two countries are already extremely economically intertwined and interdependent in many ways, and so I'm not sure there's a way Xi could actually buy off Prime Minister Abe, if I understood your question correctly. But to solve the political distrust and to put aside the security issues, for example, could lead to much more economic cooperation and development and benefit for both, especially as Japan has to figure out how to deal with a China that's moving up the value-added chain of production, and yet, as we've talked about in Japan, with a shrinking labor force, how can they tap into what they're already doing on the mainland and perhaps have benefits back home? So there's a lot that can be done that is going to be more difficult when you have these types of tensions and strains in the relationship.
So there is a connection between third arrow and TPP, and success in third arrow will increase probability of early conclusion of TPP, and vice versa. If TPP succeeds, then that will give the momentum for the third arrow to be successful. I cannot think of the scenario of the TPP failure. I think that's very important for Mr. Abe, and also for the U.S. And other nations like Australia and New Zealand and Canada. So slow or fast, the TPP will be concluded, and I think the question is when and not whether.
I just guess that if there's no TPP and no third arrow structural reforms and no kind of investment coming from abroad, but still the stock prices might be at a high level, then the administration can flow. But if the stock prices fall, I think the approval rating of Prime Minister Abe will fall together, because it depends on the economic performance. So this is all I say. But then even if there's no TPP concluded in the near future, because there's no TPA granted to the President of the United States, probably Japan should keep fighting to liberalize our economic system and conclude the EPA with EU and other countries. I think the EPA with Australia is pretty promising, so we should keep working in that line. Having said this, I think I ask Professor Ito to make final conclusion or concluding remarks.
Okay. Thank you very much for participating in our session of USJI, and I think we have a very fruitful discussions. And I think the last commentator mentioned that our political panel and economic panel were two separate and stand alone rather than interacting. Maybe we have to improve on those interactions, but there was too little time today. So I hope you enjoyed our panel as much as we enjoyed ourselves. and hopefully gave you some new insights on the Japanese economy or the Japanese political situation and Japanese relations with other economies and other countries. So thank you very much for your participation.